Imagine the streets of Harlem that were once vibrant in the 1930s, a hub of black culture, creativity, and resilience. Jazz melodies ring out of bustling clubs, poets recite verses that inspire hope, and families striving, trying to create a better future despite mounting challenges. But beyond this vibrance was an invisible but ever-present storm of racism, economic exploitation, and police oppression. All it took was one spark for it to unfold and ignite Harlem into chaos, and on March 19, 1935, that spark was lit. This story began with a 16-year-old black male teenager named Lino Rivera. Though the full details are not clear, like shadows cast on a Harlem evening, the narrative has it that Lino Rivera entered the Crest department store, reached for a 10-cent penknife, and slipped it into his pocket. When he was caught, the store's staff decided to teach him a lesson. What happened next became a flashpoint for Harlem's frustration. Rumors of this incident spread like wildfire. "They beat him," some whispered. "He's dead," others exclaimed. In a dispensation where black lives were critically undervalued, such rumors weren't just believable but were expected. The anger that has piled up due to years of ugly, violent, and racial prejudice led the community to rise on this matter. But this wasn't just about a boy and a penknife. The streets of Harlem, that was already dangerously insecure on the edge, were about to burst in one of the most unforgettable moments of 20th century black history. To truly understand what happened that night, we need to pace backward and see the bigger picture. Harlem wasn't just any neighborhood, it was a living contradiction. On one hand, it was the heart of the Harlem Renaissance, a cultural explosion of art, literature, and music. On the other hand, it was dying under deep-rooted racism and poverty. Overcrowded tenements, exploitative landlords, and high unemployment rates were a stark reality for most residents. The few jobs available were grueling and often reserved for white workers. As we dive deeper into this video, we'll take a look into the heart of that storm. The Harlem Riot wasn't just an isolated incident. It was the culmination of decades of systemic oppression, economic disparity, and unfulfilled promises waiting for the opportunity to erupt. While it may have started with the alleged theft of a penknife, it was about something much bigger: justice, equality, and the right to exist with dignity and be treated like a human. But here's the twist: the truth of what happened that night and why has been falsified, buried under layers of misinformation, biased reports, and obvious lies. The media at the time was quick to paint the black community as violent, lawless, and destructive. Yet if you dig deeper, you'll realize a different narrative. One that speaks of survival, resilience, and the unyielding demand for respect. By the end of this video, you'll see Harlem not just as a place on the map, but as a symbol of both the unyielding strength and the deep-seated pain of Black America. You'll hear stories of bravery and loss, resilience and despair, and you'll walk away with a deeper understanding of what happened on March 19, 1935, and why it matters now more than ever. Now let's dive into Harlem, 1935, and see how one fateful night changed the narrative. Harlem wasn't just another neighborhood in New York City, it was a unique and complex environment. Harlem stood as a beacon of hope, a cultural epicenter, and a battleground for survival all at once. To fully understand the significance of the riot, we must first uncover the conditions that made Harlem both a sanctuary and a powder keg. At the turn of the 20th century, Harlem was not the vibrant black community we now know it for. It was originally an affluent white community, lined with elegant brownstones, wide avenues, and new developments. But the tide turned with the early 1900s economic downturn. Wealthier white residents began moving out, and real estate developers saw an opportunity. They started marketing Harlem to black families who were seeking refuge from the oppressive conditions of the South. Enter the Great Migration. Between 1910 and 1930, millions of African Americans fled the horrors of Jim Crow laws and lynchings in the South, heading north in search of freedom and opportunity. Many landed in New York City, and Harlem became their home. In the 1920s, Harlem was the largest concentration of black people in the United States. Life in Harlem was a struggle to balance between pride and pain. Yes, this neighborhood was thriving culturally, but economically, it was struggling. The jobs that were available to black men and women were often menial, exploitative, and poorly paid. Domestic work and labor-intensive jobs were the norm, and even these opportunities were scarce. The Great Depression of the 1930s had an extreme impact on Harlem. Unemployment rates increased and many families were pushed to an extreme state of poverty. Hunger became a daily reality for the people. While Harlem residents fought to maintain their dignity, they were met with systemic barriers at every turn. Banks refused to give them loans, landlords increased rents, and white-owned businesses in the area profited off black dollars without reinvesting in the community. The presence of the police only made matters worse. Instead of serving as protectors, police officers in Harlem were often seen as enforcers of racial oppression. They patrolled the streets not to ensure safety, but to instill fear. Arrests were made on the flimsiest of pretexts, and brutality was a common occurrence. Despite these challenges, Harlem excelled culturally, becoming the epicenter of what would be known as the Harlem Renaissance. From the 1920s to the mid-1930s, the neighborhood gave birth to a wave of artistic, literary, and musical innovation that captivated the world. The likes of Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Countee Cullen penned works that celebrated black identity and resilience. Jazz legends like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong filled clubs with music that broke boundaries. Marcus Garvey's call for black empowerment and W.E.B. Du Bois' leadership in the NAACP inspired activism and pride in black heritage. For decades, the black community in Harlem faced the consequences of injustice, not with silence, but with resilience. They marched in protest, wrote fiery essays, and sang songs of resistance. But the oppressors didn't give in. Instead, the police who were meant to serve and protect the people became enforcers of the status quo, going down hard on the very people they were sworn to protect. Harlem's cultural renaissance wasn't just about art and music. It was a way for black Americans to claim their space in a society that tried to erase them. It was a declaration of existence and excellence in the face of racial oppression. But here's the irony. While Harlem was celebrated for its creativity, the very people who created these innovations often lived in poverty. The neighborhood's cultural achievements didn't affect economic or social equality. The same clubs that showcased black talent often excluded black patrons. The authors and activists who spoke of progress knew that true liberation remained out of reach. During the early 1930s, Harlem was a neighborhood fluctuating on the edge. Activists and community leaders tried to address these issues through protests, petitions, and community organizing. But the change was slow to come. Organizations like the NAACP and the Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA, voiced their demands for justice. Harlem's residents were not passive, but were keenly aware of their oppression and actively sought ways to resist. However, when peaceful methods didn't yield results, frustration began to boil over. The Great Depression aggravated these tensions. Harlem's residents saw the government bail out banks and large corporations while leaving the most vulnerable communities to fend for themselves. Hunger riots and protests erupted in cities across America, and Harlem was no exception. The people were tired of promises and platitudes. They needed action. Harlem's residents were tired of being policed, exploited, and marginalized. They wanted to be seen, heard, and treated as equals. By 1935, Harlem was a neighborhood on edge. The pressure of systemic racism, economic exploitation, and police brutality created an atmosphere ready to burst open. All it needed was a single spark, a moment that would push the community past its breaking point. That spark burst on March 19, 1935, when the incident about Lino Rivera at the Crest department store sparked up decades of frustration. The Harlem Riot was a result of years of compounded injustice. It was the cry of a community that had been ignored for far too long. But this riot wasn't just chaos, it was a message, a declaration that Harlem's residents would no longer suffer in silence. But how did this single event become a turning point, not just for Harlem, but for the broader fight for racial justice in America? In the 1930s, Harlem, the police were more enforcers of racial control and less protectors of the community. The NYPD's treatment of black residents was not only discriminatory, but also brutal. For many, encounters with the police did not end with justice, but with humiliation or violence. Black residents were criminalized for minor infractions, or none at all, while white residents committing similar offenses often faced little to no punishment. This double standard caused resentment and fear and made the police a symbol of oppression rather than community protection. To make matters worse, the legal system did not offer substantial support. Complaints against police brutality were constantly reported, and officers were rarely held accountable. For Harlem's residents, justice was not blind, it was deliberately absent. At the heart of Harlem's struggles was economic disparity. While the neighborhood was celebrated for its cultural contributions, its residents faced staggering levels of poverty. Black workers were often relegated to the lowest-paying, most unstable jobs, such as janitorial work, domestic service, and manual labor. Even these opportunities were scarce, and unemployment rates in Harlem soared during the Great Depression. Exploitation went beyond the job market. Harlem's economy was dominated by white-owned businesses that profited from the black community but gave very little in return. Housing conditions became a severe challenge. Families were crammed into overcrowded tenements that were poorly maintained and extremely unsafe. Most landlords didn't even live in Harlem, neglected repairs but were quick to raise rents. For every dollar Harlem residents earned, a significant portion was put back into the pockets of absentee landlords and white business owners. Department stores and shops in Harlem were eager to accept money from black customers, but refused to hire them. This blatant discrimination became a focal point that sparked boycotts and protests. The slogan, "Don't buy where you can't work," became a rallying cry, uniting residents to combat economic injustice. Harlem was initially designed to accommodate around 200,000 people, but by the 1930s, the population had expanded to over 300,000. This rapid influx that was caused by the Great Migration created severe overcrowding. Apartments that were meant for single families were subdivided into cramped airless rooms to house multiple tenants. Sanitation was poor, diseases spread easily, and infant mortality rates were extremely high. Harlem residents watched as their demands for equality were ignored or dismissed by those in power. Activists who tried to address these issues faced fierce opposition, both from white authorities and from within their ranks. Divisions within the community between older generations and younger activists, or between moderate leaders and radicals, further complicated efforts to organize for change. The media played a significant role in heightening tensions in Harlem. White-owned newspapers often sensationalized crimes involving black suspects, painting the entire community as dangerous and lawless. This fed into racist stereotypes and justified the heavy-handed tactics of law enforcement. At the same time, black-owned newspapers like the Amsterdam News sought to counter this narrative by pointing out police brutality and economic injustice. These publications became essential tools for organizing protests and boycotts, but they also amplified the community's frustrations by exposing the sheer scale of systemic oppression. Flyers, pamphlets, and grassroots campaigns spread information rapidly, mobilizing residents but also inflicting anger. Whether intentionally or not, the media acted as both a mirror reflecting Harlem's struggles and a magnifying glass intensifying its tensions. By 1935, Harlem was heated like a pressure cooker. Every police raid, every eviction notice, and every discriminatory policy added fuel to the fire. The community's patience was wearing thin, and its anger was becoming impossible to hold back. Activists and community leaders warned city officials that Harlem was on the brink of an eruption, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. What made the situation even more volatile was the community's sense of unity. Despite their struggles, Harlem's residents were deeply connected, bounded by a shared history and collective grievances. This unity meant that when the spark finally came, the response would be swift, widespread, and impossible to ignore. March 19, 1935. It was an ordinary day in Harlem, or at least it seemed so at first. The streets bustled with activity as residents went about their normal routine, weaving through a maze of street vendors, storefronts, and music-filled air. Beneath this normal atmosphere, the community was on the edge, burdened by years of systemic inequality and the constant specter of police brutality. Harlem's residents were no strangers to injustice, but on March 19, 1935, the pressure of it all finally became too much to bear. The spark came from the most unexpected place: a simple misunderstanding over a small, inexpensive item in a department store. At the center of it all was a young black teenager, 16-year-old Lino Rivera. Like many kids his age, Lino had a mischievous streak. That afternoon, he walked into the Cress 5 and Dime store. It was a popular white-owned business in Harlem. A small penknife was on display, worth just 10 cents, a trivial item, but one that would soon trigger a monumental event. The streets of Harlem are an amplifier for the news. Passers-by shared whispers of the incident. Shop owners shared second-hand accounts, and flyers quickly circulated, fanning the flames of anger. By the time evening fell, the story of the boy killed in the Cress store had reached every corner of the neighborhood. This was not just about Lino Rivera. His alleged mistreatment became a symbol of the rooted oppression and racial inequality that Harlem's residents went through daily. People were angry about police brutality, economic exploitation, and the constant dehumanization they silenced for years. Rivera's story was the tipping point, and it resonated deeply with a community that had felt voiceless for a long time. The first signs of unrest appeared as the sun dipped below the horizon. Outside the Cress store, a small crowd began to gather, their loud voices and their emotions raw. They demanded answers. What had happened to the boy? Why had he been treated so harshly? Why were black lives always disposable in the eyes of the authorities? As tensions grew, so did the size of the crowd. Hundreds of Harlem residents rushed out into the streets. Their anger could be felt as it was getting difficult to contain. The scene was electric, a mix of outrage, desperation, and defiance. Inside the Cress store, employees watched nervously as the crowd began to swell. They locked the doors and called for police reinforcements, but the presence of law enforcement only made things worse. For many in the crowd, the police represented the very system they were protesting against, a system that brutalized their community with impunity. Shouts turned to chants, chants turned to jeers, and then the first rock was thrown. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the air, alarming the crowd's frustration. It wasn't long before more objects flew through the air, crashing into storefront windows and parked cars. The police were quickly outnumbered and unprepared. They reacted as they always did, with force. Officers waded into the crowd, swinging batons and using tear gas to disperse the protesters. But the crowd was not easily cowed. They fought back, their collective rage erupting in a way that could no longer be contained. As the night wore on, the unrest spread beyond the Cress store. Other businesses, especially those owned by white merchants, became targets. Looting broke out as desperate residents seized food, clothing, and other goods items they could never afford under the economic conditions imposed on them. Fires were set, casting a mysterious glow over Harlem's streets and symbolizing the community's anger. Amidst the chaos, the voices of Harlem's leaders rang out. Some, like activist A. Philip Randolph, tried to calm the crowd, urging peaceful protest and dialogue. Others saw the riot as a reaction to systemic oppression. At the same time, city officials scrambled to contain the situation. Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, who is known for his progressive stance on racial issues, faced heavy pressure to respond decisively. He ordered more police into Harlem, hoping to curb the unrest before it spread further. The media, both local and national, quickly picked up the story, but their coverage was often biased and inflammatory. Many white-owned newspapers described the rioters as criminals and troublemakers, ignoring the systemic issues that primarily led to the conflict. Meanwhile, black-owned publications painted a different picture, expressing the community's grievances and calling for justice. During the early hours of March 20th, the riot had begun to subside, but the damages had already been done. A large number of people had been injured, and the property destruction was massive. Harlem, which was once a beacon of hope and resilience, now bore the scars of its frustration. Yet, Even in the aftermath, the questions lingered. What would become of Harlem? Would the voices of its residents finally be heard? Or would the riot be dismissed as just another instance of urban disorder? The events of March 19, 1935, were not just a random explosion of anger. They were a reckoning moment when the weight of racial injustice and segregation became unbearable, and a community fought back against a society that refused to see their humanity. This was the spark that lit the fire, and while the flames may have eventually died down, the lessons of that night continue to burn bright, reminding us that the fight for justice is far from over. The white-owned businesses that became targets were seen as symbols of exploitation, profiting off Harlem's black residents while offering little in return. Personal accounts from that night paint a vivid picture of a community caught in turmoil. A young woman named Clara described watching her neighbors smash the windows of a grocery store that had long been accused of charging unreasonably high prices. It wasn't just about stealing, she recalled years later. It was about sending a message that we were tired of being taken advantage of. Meanwhile, an elderly man named James, who had lived in Harlem for decades, recounted how he tried to shield his grandchildren from the chaos. "I couldn't blame the people out there," he said. "We'd been pushed and pushed, and now we were pushing back, but it was scary to see it all unfold." The New York Police Department, notorious for its heavy-handed tactics in black neighborhoods, played a central role in escalating the violence. Officers who were armed with batons and tear gas clashed with residents, further fanning the flames of anger and resentment. Eyewitnesses reported indiscriminate beatings from officers, targeting innocent bystanders. At one point, reinforcements were called in, and the police presence in Harlem doubled. But instead of restoring order, their increased numbers only added to the tensions. Certain areas of Harlem became focal points of the unrest. The intersection of 125th Street and 7th Avenue, which is often referred to as the heart of Harlem, experienced some of the most intense clashes between residents and police. The Crest department store, where the initial incident occurred, became a focal point of anger. Its windows shattered and goods looted. White-owned businesses along Lenox Avenue also faced the consequences of the destruction. In contrast, black-owned businesses were deliberately spared by rioters to target those they saw as oppressors. As the night drew closer, the unrest spread beyond the initial epicenter. In some areas, impromptu barricades were erected to block police access. Groups of young men patrolled the streets, some armed with makeshift weapons, determined to defend their neighborhood against what they saw as an oppressive force. The riot lasted well into the night, and by the time order was restored, the toll was devastating. 3 people were reported dead, all black residents caught in the crossfire between police and rioters. Hundreds were injured, some by police batons, others in the chaos of looting and destruction. Over 100 arrests were made, with many of those detained facing harsh sentences in the following weeks. The economic damage was extremely alarming. The figurative estimated cost of the destruction was over $2 million in today's currency worth. Dozens of businesses were permanently shuttered, unable to recover from the losses. But for Harlem's residents, the true cost wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in lives disrupted, trust eroded, and dreams deferred. On the morning of March 20th, 1935, the neighborhood was a shadow of its former self. Smoke was still floating in the air, and the streets were littered with debris. Residents emerged from their homes to survey the damage. Their faces were a mix of anger, exhaustion, and despair. For Harlem's black residents, the damage was far more personal. Many of the businesses that had been looted or destroyed were black-owned or had served as community basic or essential supply manufacturers. The destruction felt like a cruel twist of fate. One iconic example was the destruction of Small's Paradise, a beloved nightclub and cornerstone of Harlem's cultural identity. Its owner, Ed Smalls, lamented about the financial loss and the symbolic damage to Harlem's spirit. The government's response to the riot was swift but, unsurprisingly, flawed. Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, a progressive by the standards of the time, immediately formed the Mayor's Commission on Conditions in Harlem to investigate the root causes of the unrest. For the first time, the city acknowledged that the riot wasn't just an act of lawlessness. but the result of deep-seated racial and economic inequality. The Commission's report, which was released in October 1935, was groundbreaking in its truthfulness. It identified systemic issues like poverty, discrimination, police brutality, and economic exploitation as the primary causes of the riot. One particularly damning section of the report stated, "The riot was not the product of a single incident, but the culmination of long-standing grievances and frustrations among Harlem's residents, particularly its Negro population." However, while the report was progressive in its acknowledgement of systemic issues, it didn't have tangible recommendations. There were calls for better police-community relations and vague promises of economic reforms, but few concrete steps were taken. Days after the riot, the white-owned press largely framed Harlem's black residents as unruly and dangerous. Headlines like "Negro Mob Wreaks Havoc in Harlem" and "Harlem Erupts in Race Riot" perpetuated harmful stereotypes and ignored the root causes of the outrage. The black press, however, told a different story. Publications like the New York Amsterdam News and the Pittsburgh Courier shed light on the systemic injustices that led to the riot. They emphasized the community's frustrations with police brutality, economic exploitation, and the lack of opportunities for Harlem's residents. Langston Hughes, who was one of Harlem's most prominent voices, captured the sentiment of the community in his poem The Ballad of the Landlord, which reflected the anger and despair that fueled the riot. Hughes wrote, "Landlord, landlord, these steps are broken down. When you come up yourself, it's a wonder you don't fall down." Despite the devastation, Harlem's residents demonstrated remarkable resilience. Community leaders, churches, and civic organizations came together to rebuild both physically and emotionally. Fundraisers were organized to support Black-owned businesses that had been destroyed. Churches held vigils to mourn the dead and injured while calling for unity and perseverance. Activists like Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who was a young minister at the Abyssinian Baptist Church, grew as powerful voices for change. Powell used his platform to contend for justice and accountability. The riot also forced Harlem's residents to confront difficult questions about the future. How could they channel their anger into meaningful change? How could they rebuild their community while continuing to fight against systemic oppression? This event became a turning point in several ways. For one, it was the first modern race riot in American history that set a precedent for how future uprisings would unfold. Unlike previous riots, which were often instigated by white mobs attacking black communities, the riot also exposed the limitations of New Deal policies. While President Franklin D. Roosevelt's programs were designed to alleviate the effects of the Great Depression, they largely excluded Black Americans from it. The riot forced policymakers to reckon with the racial inequities embedded in these programs, though meaningful change was slow to come. From the Los Angeles riots in 1992 to the nationwide protests that were caused by the murder of George Floyd in 2020, the echoes of Harlem can still be heard. These events remind us that history is not just a record of the past, but a guide for the present and future. Perhaps the most sobering legacy of the Harlem Riot is how much it mirrors modern struggles. The same issues that ignited Harlem in 1935, police brutality, economic inequality, and housing discrimination, are still practiced in some parts of America's city. This is a moment that demands we pay attention, take responsibility, and carry its lessons forward. Let us honor the legacy of those who lived through that fateful night in 1935 by continuing the fight for justice and equality today. The struggles they faced were not in vain, and their lessons remain as relevant now as they were then. The question is, will we listen? Will we act? The future is ours to shape, but only if we learn from the past. Every march, every protest, and every demand for justice today is part of the same fight that Harlem's residents waged in 1935. The voices calling for change then echo through time, reminding us that progress is possible, but only if we remain vigilant, united, and resilient in our pursuit of equity and justice.